Welcome to Bedtime Express, your gentle journey into peaceful sleep through the most beautiful stories in history. Tonight, we're traveling back to the golden age of the Ottoman Empire, where we'll discover the magnificent tale of Sultan Süleyman and his beloved Hürrem. This is a story of conquest and love, of palace intrigue and great campaigns, woven together like silk threads in a dreamy tapestry that will carry you softly into slumber. Over the next 3 hours, you'll drift through the perfumed gardens of the Topkapi Palace, witness the sieges of Belgrade and Vienna, and experience the tender love story between an emperor and the woman who captured his heart. Our tale unfolds slowly and peacefully, designed to quiet your mind and ease you into the most restful sleep. If you enjoy tonight's journey, please give this video a gentle like, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to Bedtime Express for more soothing historical tales. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss a new bedtime story. Now, settle into your most comfortable position. Close your eyes if you wish, and let the gentle rhythm of our story carry you away to the magical world of Süleyman the Magnificent. Sweet dreams await you on the Bedtime Express. Süleyman the Magnificent, the Sultan's greatest campaigns. As the golden years of the 1540s melted into the 1550s like honey flowing from a warm spoon, each drop sweet with the memory of victories won and territories claimed, Süleyman's empire had reached a magnificence that poets struggled to capture in verses and artists despaired of rendering in paint. The Sultan himself, now in his 60s, moved through his palace with the stately grace of one who had seen dreams become reality and ambitions transform into lasting monuments that would endure long after their creator had returned to dust. His hair, once dark as a moonless night over the Bosphorus, now showed silver threads that caught the light like scattered stars, while his eyes held the deep wisdom that comes only to those who have ruled justly and loved completely, who have made decisions that shaped the destinies of millions, and yet never lost sight of the human heart that beats beneath the imperial crown. Hürrem, his beloved companion through decades of triumph and challenge, had become more than just the Sultan's consort. She had evolved into his partner in the truest sense, her intelligence and political insight as valuable to the empire as any army or treasury. Her counsel sought not just in matters of the heart, but in questions of statecraft that would have challenged the most experienced diplomats. When foreign ambassadors came to the Ottoman court, arriving with gifts and proposals from distant kingdoms, they would often find themselves dealing not just with the Sultan's official ministers, but with recommendations and perspectives that clearly originated from the woman who had captured and kept the heart of the most powerful ruler in the world. Her correspondence with European queens and noble ladies, written in elegant script on paper, perfumed with rose water and sealed with wax that bore her personal symbol, created diplomatic channels that complemented and sometimes surpassed the official negotiations conducted by viziers and pashas trained in the traditional arts of international relations. The palace around them had become a world unto itself, a miniature universe where every detail reflected the glory of the empire and the refinement of Ottoman civilization. The gardens, tended by master horticulturists who treated each flowerbed like a canvas for living art, bloomed in carefully orchestrated sequences that ensured beauty in every season. From the early tulips that announced spring's arrival to the late blooming chrysanthemums that provided color until winter's first snow. Fountains sang throughout these gardens with voices that had been tuned like musical instruments, their waters flowing through channels carved with geometric patterns that created visual harmonies as pleasing to the eye as the water's sound was to the ear, while peacocks wandered the pathways like living jewels, their cries adding exotic notes to the garden's natural symphony. The libraries of the Topkapi had grown during Süleyman's reign to become repositories of knowledge that rivaled any collection in the world, their shelves holding manuscripts in dozens of languages from Arabic and Persian to Greek and Latin, from Chinese treatises on medicine to Indian works on mathematics, creating a treasury of human wisdom that scholars would travel thousands of miles to consult. In the evenings, when the day's administrative duties were complete and the palace settled into its quieter rhythms, Süleyman would often retreat to these chambers where knowledge waited like patient friend, reading works of poetry and philosophy that transported his mind to distant lands and different centuries. Hürrem would sometimes join him in these literary journeys, her own education having expanded dramatically during her years at court until she could discuss the finer points of Persian verse or the strategic insights of classical historians with an understanding that impressed even the Flive, palace's most learned scholars. But even in this golden twilight of their reign, new challenges emerged like distant storm clouds on previously clear horizons, reminders that empire, however magnificent, existed in a world where other powers harbored their own ambitions and nursed their own grievances. The Mediterranean, which had become increasingly an Ottoman lake with fleets flying the crescent banner dominating trade routes that had once been controlled by Venetian and Genoese merchants, still harbored islands of resistance where Christian forces maintained strongholds that served as both military bases and symbols of defiance against Ottoman expansion. Chief among these was Malta, a small island that sat in the central Mediterranean like a stone fortress rising from waters that reflected the endless dance of sunlight and shadow, its strategic position making it a key to control over the sea routes that connected the empire's European and African territories. The Knights of St. John, those same warrior monks who had been expelled from Rhodes, with such honor decades earlier, had made Malta their new home after years of wandering through European courts in search of a new base from which to continue their centuries-old mission of fighting Islamic expansion. Under the leadership of Grand Master Jean Parisot de Valette, a man whose name would become legend for his courage and determination, they had transformed the island into a fortress that combined medieval fortifications with the latest innovations in military engineering developed by Italian experts who understood how cannon fire had revolutionized the ancient art of siege warfare. From Malta's harbors, Christian galleys sailed forth to disrupt Ottoman shipping routes, like wolves emerging from a mountain lair to hunt in valleys below. Their success measured not just in captured vessels and seized cargo, but in the psychological impact of proving that Ottoman naval power, however dominant, was not absolute or unassailable. The decision to conquer Malta came to Süleyman during one of those quiet evening conversations with Hürrem, as they sat in their private garden where fountains sang gentle lullabies and rose petals scattered across paths like fallen stars, their perfume mixing with the cooler night air to create an atmosphere of peaceful contemplation that seemed far removed from the harsh realities of military planning. The island's strategic importance was undeniable. Whoever controlled Malta could command the sea routes between Constantinople and the Ottoman territories in North Africa, like a key that could lock or unlock the very heart of Mediterranean commerce, determining whether Ottoman merchants could trade freely or would face constant harassment from Christian raiders. But beyond mere strategy lay a matter of honor and reputation, for as long as the knights continued their raids from their island fortress, they served as a reminder that Ottoman power, magnificent though it was, remained incomplete, like a beautiful tapestry with one thread pulled loose that drew attention to itself and diminished the overall effect. The Great Siege of Malta began in May 1565, as spring flowers bloomed across the island's rocky landscape in defiance of the coming storm, and fishing boats returned to harbors that would soon echo with the thunder of artillery and the cries of men locked in desperate combat. The Ottoman fleet that appeared on the horizon was magnificent beyond description. Nearly 200 vessels carrying 40,000 men, their sails billowing like clouds that had descended to dance upon the waves, their hulls gleaming with fresh paint, and their banners snapping proudly in the Mediterranean breeze. At their head sailed Piali Pasha and Mustafa Pasha, two of Süleyman's most trusted commanders, men whose experience had been gained through decades of successful campaigns from the walls of Vienna to the deserts of Baghdad, their reputations for competence and courage preceding them like heralds, announcing the approach of victory itself. The sight of this approaching armada must have filled the defenders of Malta with emotions as complex as the patterns in the Persian carpets that decorated their commanders' quarters. Fear was certainly present, for no rational person could look upon such overwhelming force without feeling the chill touch of mortality, but it was tempered by the fierce pride of men who had dedicated their lives to a cause they considered sacred, and by the practical knowledge that retreat was impossible and surrender would mean not just death, but the extinction of their order's centuries-old mission. Grand Master de Valette, standing on the battlements of Fort St. Elmo as the Ottoman ships filled the horizon like a forest of masts and sails, must have felt like a character from an ancient epic, facing odds that would have daunted heroes of legend, while knowing that his actions in the coming weeks would determine whether the Knights of St. John would continue to exist or would join the ranks of military orders that had vanished into the mists of history. Yet Malta proved to be unlike any previous Ottoman conquest, a puzzle that refused to yield to traditional solutions, a fortress that seemed to grow stronger under pressure rather than weaker, like a spring that becomes more resilient the more it is compressed. The island's fortifications, designed by the finest military engineers of the age who had studied every successful siege of the previous century and incorporated lessons learned from defeats as well as victories, represented the latest developments in the science of defensive architecture. The bastions and ravelins, the covered ways and sally ports, the interlocking fields of fire and carefully calculated angles of approach, all combined to create a defensive system that was less like a traditional fortress and more like a mathematical problem expressed in stone and earth, where every Ottoman advance would be met by predetermined responses that maximized the defender's advantages while neutralizing the attacker's superior numbers. The knights, though numbering fewer than 1,000 European nobles and professional soldiers, were supported by several thousand Maltese militia and civilian volunteers who fought with the desperate determination of people defending their own homes and families. These local defenders brought to the siege an intimate knowledge of every cave and pathway, every hidden spring and secret passage, that transformed the island from a simple military objective into a living entity that seemed to resist conquest with intelligence and purpose. Children who had played among the rocky cliffs became guides for nighttime raids, while women who had tended gardens and raised families became suppliers of ammunition and nurses for the wounded, creating a web of resistance that extended far beyond the formal boundaries of military organization. For 4 months, the siege continued like a slow dance between irresistible force and immovable object, each day bringing new assaults that crashed against the island's defenses like waves against cliffs, each night bringing desperate repairs and preparations for the trials that dawn would inevitably bring. The Ottoman forces, despite their overwhelming numbers and superior equipment, found themselves grinding slowly forward through a landscape that seemed to resist every advance, where every stone had been positioned to extract the maximum cost from any attacker, where every yard of ground gained came at a price that grew heavier with each passing week. The great cannon that had reduced the walls of Belgrade and Rhodes to rubble found themselves facing fortifications that had been designed specifically to withstand artillery bombardment, their shots absorbed by earthen ramparts and angled bastions that deflected the energy of impact rather than allowing it to concentrate in destructive force. In Constantinople, Süleyman received reports of the siege's progress with growing unease, like a chess master watching a game where his most elegant strategies repeatedly encounter unexpected defenses that transform certain victory into uncertain struggle. The carefully neutral language of official dispatches could not disguise the reality that Malta was proving far more difficult than anyone had anticipated, that the island's defenders were displaying a level of resourcefulness and determination that impressed even their enemies, and that the Ottoman forces, for the first time in decades, were facing the possibility of failure in a major military undertaking. Hürrem, reading these reports with the eye of one long practiced in decoding diplomatic correspondence, understood that Malta was becoming something more than a military objective. It was becoming a test of Ottoman invincibility itself, a symbol whose fall or survival would echo throughout the courts of Europe and shape perceptions of Ottoman power for generations to come. The siege reached its climax in the blazing heat of Mediterranean summer, when the sun turned the rocky island into a furnace that tested the endurance of besiegers and besieged alike, making every drop of water precious and every patch of shade a temporary paradise. The assault on Fort St. Elmo, which controlled the entrance to Malta's Grand Harbor, became a grueling battle of attrition that lasted for weeks, with the fort changing hands multiple times as Ottoman forces stormed the breach, only to be driven back by desperate counterattacks that left the ground carpeted with the bodies of brave men from both sides. When the fort finally fell, after resistance that had cost the Ottomans thousands of casualties, the victors found fewer than 50 defenders still alive among the ruins, their courage having extracted such a terrible price that even their enemies honored their memory with the respect due to fallen heroes. As autumn arrived with its cargo of shorter days and cooler nights, bringing relief supplies to the beleaguered knights from Christian Europe, and hope to defenders who had begun to believe that death was their only possible escape, the Ottoman commanders faced the reality that winter storms would soon make continued operations impossible. The decision to withdraw came not with the dramatic finality of a crushing defeat, but with the quiet acknowledgement that sometimes even the mightiest empires must recognize the limits of their reach, that there are fortresses which cannot be taken by force alone, and that strategic wisdom sometimes requires the courage to retreat rather than the persistence to continue a hopeless struggle. The Ottoman fleet departed Malta's waters as the first winter storms gathered on the horizon, carrying with them the knowledge that they had encountered something new in their experience, an enemy that could not be overcome through strength alone, defenders whose will to resist had proven stronger than the most sophisticated military machine in the world. The failure at Malta sent ripples throughout Europe like stones dropped in still water, each circle carrying news that the Ottoman Empire, for the first time in living memory, had been forced to abandon a major siege without achieving its objectives. In the courts of Vienna and Madrid, Paris and Rome, where diplomats and ministers had grown accustomed to Ottoman victories being announced with the regularity of seasonal changes, the impossible had become reality. Süleyman the Magnificent had finally encountered a fortress he could not conquer, a puzzle he could not solve through the application of overwhelming force. The psychological impact of this reverse was perhaps even more significant than its military implications, for it demonstrated that Ottoman power, however formidable, was not unlimited, and that determination and superior defensive positions could sometimes prevail against numerical and technological advantages that seemed insurmountable. But for Süleyman himself, approaching his 70th year with the measured pace of one who had spent decades learning wisdom's hardest lessons through personal experience of triumph and loss, the setback at Malta was less a catastrophe than a reminder that even the grandest dreams must acknowledge the constraints of reality. In the perfumed chambers of the Topkapi Palace, where he and Hürrem had shared so many conversations about the future they were building together, where maps and plans covered tables like architectural drawings for a palace of ambitions, he began to speak more often of legacy than of conquest, more of preservation than of expansion, recognizing that his greatest achievements lay not in territories yet to be won, but in the empire he had already transformed and the institutions he had created to ensure its continued prosperity. Tragedy struck their personal world like lightning from a clear sky when Prince Mehmed, their beloved eldest son and heir apparent, died suddenly at the age of 21, his death as unexpected as a candle flame extinguished by an invisible breath of wind. The loss hit both parents like an earthquake that shook the very foundations of their world, transforming their private apartments into chambers of mourning, where even the fountains seemed to weep and the gardens appeared to wilt in sympathy with their grief. Hürrem, who had invested so much of her political energy in securing Mehmed's succession, who had dreamed of seeing her son rule the empire they had built together, found herself devastated, not just as a mother experiencing the worst loss imaginable, but as an architect of dynastic continuity whose carefully laid plans had crumbled like sandcastles touched by an unexpected tide. The years that followed Mehmed's death were marked by a subtle but profound shift in the palace dynamics, like a great clock whose mainspring has been damaged and now keeps time differently, still functional, but no longer possessing the perfect precision that had once characterized its operation. Süleyman, though still the supreme ruler of his vast empire, still capable of making decisions that affected the lives of millions, began to delegate more authority to his remaining viziers while spending longer hours in private contemplation, walking through gardens where he and his lost son had once discussed the future of the empire. Hürrem, her own health beginning to show signs of the strain that comes from decades of navigating court intrigue while bearing and raising children in the artificial atmosphere of palace life, focused her remaining energy on securing the future of her surviving sons, Selim and Bayezid, understanding that their rivalry might tear apart everything she and Süleyman had built together if not carefully managed. When Hürrem herself died in 1558, just months after their beloved Mehmed had been laid to rest in a tomb decorated with verses from the Quran that spoke of paradise and reunion, Süleyman found himself alone in a way he had not experienced since his youth. The woman who had been his partner in love and statecraft, his advisor and confidant, his connection to the world of intimate human emotion that balanced the grand impersonality of imperial rule, was gone like a flower that had bloomed beautifully for decades before returning to the earth from which it had sprung. The palace, though still filled with thousands of servants and officials, courtiers and concubines, guards and administrators, seemed to echo with emptiness that no amount of ceremonial splendor could disguise, like a magnificent theater where the most important actor has left the stage and the remaining players struggle to continue the performance without the presence that had given meaning to all their roles. In the gentle mists of time, where dreams and history danced together like silk scarves in a warm breeze, there lived a sultan whose name would echo through the ages like a lullaby sung by the stars. His name was Süleyman, and he would become known as the Magnificent, though in the quiet hours before dawn, when the world was soft and still, he was simply a young prince learning the weight of destiny. Born on a November night when the constellation of Leo painted silver patterns across the Ottoman sky, he had entered this world as if summoned by the very heavens to fulfill a purpose written in starlight and sealed with the dreams of generations. The year was 1520, and the Ottoman Empire stretched like a great tapestry across 3 continents, its threads woven with gold and dreams, its borders extending from the misty shores of the Danube to the sun-scorched deserts of Arabia. When young Süleyman ascended to the throne at the tender age of 26, the palace halls whispered with anticipation, like leaves rustling secrets in an enchanted garden where every flower held the promise of uncharted adventures. The courtiers moved like shadows in their flowing robes, their footsteps soft as moonbeams on marble floors, polished to mirror brightness by generations of careful hands. His father, Selim the Grim, had ruled with the fierce intensity of a desert storm, expanding the empire's eastern borders and bringing Egypt under Ottoman control like a master chess player, claiming the board's most valuable pieces. But Selim's reign had been brief as a shooting star, burning brilliantly for 8 years before death claimed him, leaving behind an empire vast as an ocean and a son who possessed both the intelligence to understand its complexity and the vision to imagine its future greatness. The transition from father to son occurred as smoothly as silk flowing through gentle fingers, yet everyone in the palace understood that they were witnessing not merely the continuation of a dynasty, but the beginning of a new chapter in the story of empire itself. In those early days of his reign, before the great campaigns began and the legends took shape, Süleyman would spend hours in the palace library, where thousands of manuscripts lay arranged like sleeping treasures on shelves that stretched towards ceilings decorated with geometric patterns that seemed to capture infinity in their endless repetitions. The books spoke to him in Arabic and Persian, Turkish and Greek, their pages yellow as autumn leaves, but containing wisdom fresh as spring rain. Here he studied the campaigns of Alexander the Great, whose armies had swept across Asia like wildfire, and the strategies of Caesar, who had made the Mediterranean a Roman lake through will and genius combined. The young Sultan's education had been as carefully cultivated as the roses in the palace gardens, each subject chosen to prepare him for the multifaceted challenges of ruling an empire that spanned continents and embraced dozens of cultures. His tutors, men whose beards were white with wisdom and whose eyes twinkled with the satisfaction of sharing knowledge with a truly gifted student, had taught him not only the arts of war and statecraft, but also poetry and music, astronomy and mathematics. When Süleyman read verses by the great Persian poets, his voice would take on a musical quality that made listeners forget they were hearing recitation rather than song, while his discussions of military strategy revealed a mind that could envision battlefields like three-dimensional puzzles where every piece had multiple possible positions. But this was no ordinary prince who had inherited the throne. Süleyman possessed a mind sharp as Damascus steel and a heart that burned with the desire to expand his empire beyond the horizons where the sun kissed the earth goodnight. In the hushed chambers of the Topkapi Palace, surrounded by fountains that sang gentle melodies and gardens where roses bloomed in eternal spring, he would spend long, peaceful hours planning campaigns that would reshape the world. The first whispers of his greatness came not with the clash of swords, but with the quiet signing of treaties and the gentle persuasion of diplomacy. Like a master storyteller, weaving tales to lull children to sleep, Süleyman understood that true power often moved slowly, deliberately, like honey flowing from a golden spoon. He inherited an empire already vast, stretching from the pearl-white shores of the Black Sea to the sun-baked sands of North Africa, but his vision was grander still. In the dim candlelight of his private study, maps spread before him like blankets of parchment. Süleyman would trace his finger along the borders of Europe. Beyond those borders lay kingdoms that sparkled like jewels in his imagination. Hungary with its fertile plains that rolled like green waves. Austria with its mountain fortresses that stood proud as sleeping giants. And beyond them, the heart of Christian Europe itself. Each night, as the stars emerged to keep watch over his empire, he dreamed of bringing these lands into the warm embrace of Ottoman rule. The palace around him was a wonderland of quiet beauty. Peacocks wandered through courtyards where water trickled softly from marble fountains, their calls echoing gently across gardens perfumed with jasmine and orange blossoms. In the evenings, when the sun painted the sky in soft purples and golds, the Sultan would walk these gardens, his silk robes rustling like whispered prayers, contemplating the campaigns that would soon unfold like chapters in a magnificent book. The Ottoman army that would carry out his dreams was itself a thing of beauty and precision. The Janissaries, those elite soldiers who moved with the discipline of dancers and fought with the fury of lions, trained in courtyards where their synchronized movements created patterns as mesmerizing as falling leaves. Their uniforms gleamed white as fresh snow, their tall caps nodding like flowers in a gentle breeze as they practiced their drills. At night, their encampments glowed with the warm light of countless fires, creating constellations on earth that mirrored the stars above. But Süleyman knew that conquest was more than armies and strategies. In the quiet moments before sleep, when the palace settled into peaceful slumber, he understood that his greatest victories would come not just from the strength of his sword, but from the wisdom of his rule and the justice of his laws. The empire he envisioned would be like a great tree, its roots deep and strong, its branches reaching toward the heavens, providing shade and shelter for all who dwelt beneath its canopy. As his first year as Sultan drew to a close, like the final notes of a gentle lullaby, whispers began to spread through the coffee houses of Istanbul and the bazaars of Damascus. The young Sultan was preparing for his first great campaign, and the world held its breath like a child listening to a bedtime story, wondering what wonders and adventures the next chapter would bring. The golden dawn of his reign was about to give way to the brilliant noon of conquest, and history itself seemed to lean forward in anticipation. In the harem quarters of the palace, where silk curtains fluttered like butterfly wings and the air was sweet with rosewater, the women spoke in hushed tones of the campaigns to come. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, that behind every great sultan stood not just armies and advisors, but the quiet strength of those who loved him and believed in his dreams. Though they did not yet know it, among them walked a young woman whose own story would become intertwined with the Sultan's in ways that would make poets weep and historians wonder. The stage was set like a grand theater draped in velvet and gold. The actors assembled like players in a cosmic drama. Süleyman the Magnificent stood at the threshold of greatness, his empire spread before him like a sleeping giant ready to awaken. The gentle winds that swept across the Bosphorus seemed to whisper promises of victory, while the minarets of Istanbul pointed toward heaven like fingers offering prayers for the campaigns to come. The morning sun rose like a golden coin tossed into the velvet sky, and with it came the rhythmic thunder of Ottoman drums echoing across the Hungarian plains like the heartbeat of destiny itself. It was the year 1521, and Süleyman's first great campaign had begun like a magnificent dance, each movement calculated and graceful, each step bringing him closer to the fortress city of Belgrade that stood like a jeweled crown on its hill above the confluence of two rivers. The army moved like a great river flowing toward the sea, banners fluttering like prayers, flags in the gentle breeze, their colors so vivid they seemed to have been painted with liquid sunset. The sight of this approaching force must have been both terrible and beautiful to behold, like watching a storm approach across a peaceful valley. Nearly 100,000 men marched in perfect formation, their armor catching and reflecting the morning light until the entire army seemed to shimmer like a mirage made real. The Janissaries, those elite infantry whose discipline was legendary throughout Europe, moved with synchronized precision that created patterns as mesmerizing as falling leaves caught in autumn wind, their white caps nodding like flowers in a vast field that stretched beyond the horizon. Behind the soldiers came the artillery, those bronze giants that Süleyman's engineers had crafted with the same loving attention that master jewelers gave to royal crowns. Each cannon was a work of art as much as an instrument of war, decorated with verses from the Quran written in elegant calligraphy and adorned with geometric patterns that seemed to dance before the eyes of those who gazed upon them. They rolled forward on wheels that had been reinforced with bands of iron, pulled by oxen whose patient strength seemed to embody the inexorable nature of Ottoman advance, while their bronze barrels gleamed like captured sunlight against the green Hungarian countryside. Belgrade stood on its hill like a stone crown, its walls weathered by centuries of storms and sieges, its towers reaching toward heaven like stone fingers offering prayers for deliverance. For decades, this fortress had been the key that locked the door to Europe, preventing Ottoman expansion into the heart of the continent where Christian kings ruled from castles that had never known the sound of Muslim prayers. But as Süleyman's vast army spread across the plains below like a sea of silk and steel, covering the landscape with pavilions that gleamed white as fresh snow and banners that snapped proudly in the river breeze, the defenders, peering down from their towers, must have felt like sailors watching an unstoppable tide approach their shore. The siege that followed was a masterpiece of patience and precision, unfolding slowly like a flower blooming in the morning sun, each day bringing new developments that drew the noose tighter around the ancient fortress. Süleyman did not rush like an eager child seeking immediate gratification, but waited like a wise gardener, knowing that the sweetest fruits come to those who tend their dreams with careful hands and allow time to work its mysterious alchemy. His engineers, skilled as the finest clockmakers in Geneva, positioned their great cannons with the delicate care of artists arranging brushes on a palette, each placement calculated to create the maximum impact while minimizing the risk to their own forces. Each morning, as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, the great artillery would begin its daily symphony, the bronze voices speaking with thunderous authority that rolled across the Hungarian plains like the voice of God himself announcing a new age. Each day, the bronze giants would speak with voices of thunder, their words carving poetry into the ancient stones of Belgrade's walls, slowly but steadily dismantling fortifications that had stood for centuries like a patient sculptor, revealing the hidden form within a block of marble. The sound of these mighty guns became as regular as the call to prayer, marking the hours of the siege with mechanical precision that spoke of Ottoman organization and determination. In his silk pavilion, decorated with carpets that seemed to capture sunlight in their threads, Süleyman would receive reports from his commanders, while scribes recorded each detail like monks illuminating sacred texts. The tent was filled with the soft glow of oil lamps that flickered like captured stars, while outside, the camp settled into its nightly rhythm of quiet conversations and distant laughter. The Sultan's eyes, dark as midnight pools, would study maps and charts with the concentration of a poet choosing the perfect word. After 20 days of this gentle but relentless pressure, Belgrade's walls began to crumble like sandcastles touched by an incoming tide. The defenders, brave as mountain eagles, but overwhelmed by the vast forces arrayed against them, finally raised white flags that fluttered like doves' wings in the summer breeze. The great fortress, which had stood guardian over the Danube for so long, opened its gates like a flower opening to welcome the dawn. Süleyman entered Belgrade not as a conqueror drunk on victory, but as a sultan who understood that true greatness lay in mercy and wisdom. He walked through the ancient streets with the measured pace of one who knew that each stone had stories to tell, each building held memories as precious as pearls. The bells that had once called Christians to prayer continued to ring, but now they were joined by the melodious calls of muezzins, creating a harmony that spoke of a new age beginning. But the Sultan's dreams stretched far beyond the hills of Hungary. Like a navigator studying charts by candlelight, his gaze turned toward the azure waters of the Mediterranean, where the island fortress of Rhodes stood like a jewel set in blue silk. Rhodes had been the stronghold of the Knights of St. John for more than 2 centuries, its massive walls rising from the sea like the shoulders of a sleeping titan. The journey to Rhodes was itself an adventure worthy of ancient legends. The Ottoman fleet, with its hundreds of ships spreading across the water like a flock of great white birds, moved through the Aegean Sea under skies painted in shades of pearl and gold. Süleyman stood on the deck of his flagship, his robes billowing gently in the salt breeze, watching dolphins dance in the ship's wake as if celebrating the approach of destiny. When the Ottoman fleet appeared on the horizon like a forest of masts and sails, the people of Rhodes must have felt as if they were watching a dream unfold. The harbor, usually peaceful as a sleeping lake, suddenly bloomed with ships like water lilies covering a pond. The ancient walls of the city, which had withstood earthquakes and storms, now faced their greatest test as the gentle lap of waves was joined by the sound of anchors dropping like distant thunder. The siege of Rhodes lasted 6 months, unfolding like a slow and stately dance between two masterful partners. Each day brought new movements in this grand ballet of warfare, with the Ottoman forces advancing like tide pools creeping up a beach, patient and inexorable. The Knights of St. John, brave as lions and proud as eagles, fought with the desperate beauty of those who know they are playing their final scene. Süleyman himself lived in a palace of silk and gold erected on the hills overlooking the harbor, where he could watch the siege unfold like a great game of chess played with living pieces. Each evening, as the sun set behind the ancient walls and painted the sky in colors that made artists weep, he would walk among his troops, his presence bringing comfort like a father's voice singing lullabies to restless children. The soldiers, sitting around their campfires like constellations on the dark earth, would look up as he passed with eyes full of love and devotion. The end came not with a crash but with a whisper, like autumn leaves finally deciding to fall. The Grand Master of the Knights, Philippe Villiers de l'Isle Adam, emerged from the battered fortress like a figure from a dream, his white hair gleaming in the morning sun, his dignity intact as freshly fallen snow. When he met Süleyman to arrange the terms of surrender, the two men stood like characters from different stories that had somehow found themselves sharing the same page. The Sultan's treatment of the defeated knights became a legend whispered in courts across Europe, like a fairy tale told to sleeping children. Instead of chains and dungeons, he offered ships and safe passage, understanding that true victory lay not in humiliation, but in magnanimity. As the knights sailed away from Rhodes, their banners still flying proudly in the Mediterranean breeze, they carried with them stories of an enemy who had shown them more honor in defeat than many allies had shown them in victory. Rhodes, the island that had gleamed like a pearl in the blue Mediterranean, now became another jewel in Süleyman's crown. The minarets that rose beside the ancient churches created a new melody in stone and prayer, while the harbors that had once sheltered Christian warships now welcomed Ottoman merchants carrying silk and spices, dreams and stories from lands where the sun rose golden over endless horizons. As news of these victories spread across Europe like ripples from a stone dropped in still water, the name of Süleyman began to be spoken with a mixture of fear and fascination. In the courts of Vienna and Paris, in the chambers of the Vatican and the halls of Venice, kings and cardinals, merchants and scholars spoke his name in hushed tones, like children telling ghost stories by candlelight. The young Ottoman Sultan had announced his arrival on the stage of world history, and the audience held its breath, wondering what act would follow this magnificent opening. But in the quiet corners of the Topkapi Palace, where fountain water trickled like gentle rain and rose petals scattered across marble floors like fallen stars, other stories were beginning to unfold. Stories of love that would prove as powerful as any army, of a woman whose beauty and intelligence would capture the heart of an emperor and change the course of an empire. These tales, soft as silk and sweet as honey, would soon interweave with the grand narrative of conquest and create a tapestry so beautiful that poets would struggle for centuries to capture its full splendor in words. While the echoes of victory still danced like gentle music through the streets of Istanbul, carrying news of Belgrade's surrender to every corner of the city where merchants and artisans paused in their work to whisper prayers of thanksgiving, and while the artists in the palace workshops painted miniatures of the conquest that seemed to glow with their own inner light, another kind of conquest was taking place in the most secret chambers of the imperial heart. Her name was Alexandra, though history would remember her as Hürrem Sultan, the Laughing One, and she moved through the marble corridors of the Topkapi Palace like a dream made manifest, her footsteps soft as rose petals falling on silk, her presence bringing a new kind of magic to halls that had known centuries of imperial splendor. Hürrem had arrived at the palace like a character from an ancient fairy tale, captured during one of the Ottoman raids into the distant lands of Ruthenia, where forests stretched like green oceans under endless skies, and where the people possessed a different kind of beauty than the dark-eyed women of the Mediterranean world. She brought with her the wild magic of those northern places, a spirit untamed as winter wind, yet warm as summer sunshine. And when she first appeared before Süleyman in the chambers where new concubines were presented to the Sultan, the very air seemed to shimmer with possibility. Her beauty was luminous in a way that made courtiers stop their conversations mid-sentence, not because it was perfect in the classical sense, but because it seemed to radiate from some inner source that made everything around her appear more vivid, more alive, more filled with promise than it had been moments before. Her hair flowed like liquid copper, catching and holding light in ways that made observers think of autumn leaves touched by the first rays of dawn, while her eyes held the depth of forest lakes where ancient secrets lay hidden beneath surfaces that reflected sky and stars. When she spoke, her voice carried melodies that made even the Sultan's own poets pause their quills in wonder, not because of any artifice or training, but because she possessed that rare quality of making ordinary words sound like music and simple observations seem like profound wisdom. Yet beneath this natural charm lay an intelligence as sharp and flexible as a Toledo blade, capable of understanding the subtle currents of palace politics with an intuition that veteran courtiers found both impressive and slightly unsettling. In the perfumed gardens where nightingales sang lullabies to sleeping flowers, and where fountains created music from falling water that seemed to echo the rhythms of the human heart, Süleyman found himself enchanted not just by Hürrem's beauty, but by her mind that sparkled like stars reflecting in still water. She could discuss poetry with the grace of a scholar trained in the great madrasas of Baghdad, philosophy with the insight of a sage who had spent years contemplating the mysteries of existence, and military strategy with an understanding that surprised and delighted the Sultan, who had grown accustomed to conversations about warfare being limited to his male advisors. Yet when she laughed, the sound was as innocent and joyful as children playing in palace courtyards, a reminder that beneath the sophistication and intelligence lived a spirit that remained fundamentally unbroken by the complexities of court life. Their conversations, which began in the formal language of court ceremony with all its elaborate politeness and prescribed phrases, gradually softened into intimate exchanges that lasted until dawn painted the sky in shades of pearl and gold, transforming the palace gardens into landscapes that seemed borrowed from paradise itself. They would walk together through pathways lined with roses that bloomed in every shade from deep crimson to palest pink, their petals scattered by night breezes like confetti celebrating their growing closeness, while around them the palace settled into the peaceful rhythms of sleep, leaving them alone with their words and the gentle music of water flowing through channels carved from marble by craftsmen whose skill had been passed down through generations. This growing intimacy was unprecedented in Ottoman history, like a new flower blooming in a garden that had known only traditional blossoms for centuries. Sultans were expected to spread their affections like gardeners tending many plants, never allowing any single relationship to grow too deep or too strong, maintaining emotional distance that would prevent any woman from gaining too much influence over imperial decisions. But Süleyman found himself drawn to Hürrem with a force as natural and irresistible as rivers flowing toward the sea, as constant as stars wheeling through their celestial dance, as inevitable as spring following winter in the eternal cycle of seasons. The other women in the harem watched this development with emotions as complex and varied as the patterns in the Persian carpets that covered the floors of their chambers. Some felt jealousy as sharp and bitter as unripe fruit, understanding that Hürrem's rise inevitably meant their own diminishment in the Sultan's attention and affection. Others observed her success with the calculating interest of those who recognized that power within the palace was shifting like sand dunes reshaped by desert winds, and that alignment with the rising favorite might bring benefits to those wise enough to offer friendship rather than competition. Still others, particularly the older women who had served in the harem since the reign of Süleyman's father, watched with the fascination of those who understood they were witnessing something genuinely unprecedented in the carefully regulated world of Ottoman palace life. Their love story unfolded in the quiet spaces between the great campaigns, in moments stolen like precious gems from the treasury of time. When Süleyman planned his next great venture, the campaign into Hungary that would culminate at a place called Mohacs, Hürrem would sit beside him in chambers lit by hanging lamps that cast dancing shadows on walls decorated with tiles that captured sunset colors in their glaze. She became not just his beloved, but his confidant, his advisor, his partner in the dance of ruling an empire that stretched across 3 continents. As spring arrived in 1526, like a gentle promise whispered by warm winds, Süleyman began preparing for what would become his most famous European campaign. The young King Louis II of Hungary had been making alliances and gathering forces, threatening the Ottoman borders like storm clouds building on the horizon. But this threat seemed almost insignificant compared to the magnificent force that Süleyman assembled, an army so vast and splendid that it appeared to stretch from horizon to horizon like a moving city made of silk pavilions and gleaming weapons. The march through the Balkans was like a grand procession from an epic poem, with the Ottoman army flowing across the landscape like a river of gold and steel. Süleyman rode at its heart on a horse white as fresh snow, his robes streaming behind him like captured clouds, his presence giving rhythm to the march like a conductor leading a symphony of destiny. Behind him, the Janissaries moved with their characteristic precision, their white caps nodding like a field of flowers swaying in unison, while the great cannons rolled forward on wheels that turned with the inevitability of seasons changing. At Mohacs, on a plain where wildflowers had bloomed undisturbed for countless springs, the 2 armies met like characters from different stories, suddenly finding themselves sharing the same stage. The Hungarian force, brave and proud as mountain eagles, took their positions with the nobility of those who fight for hearth and homeland. King Louis II, young and gallant as a hero from legend, rode among his knights like a figure from a medieval tapestry, his banner snapping proudly in the morning breeze. But the battle that followed was less like a duel between equals and more like a force of nature meeting a heroic but fragile obstacle. The Ottoman artillery, positioned with the precision of a master painter, arranging colors on a palette, began to speak with voices that rolled across the plain like distant thunder. The Hungarian cavalry charged with magnificent courage, their horses flying across the grass like winged creatures, their lances glinting like captured starlight. Yet against the disciplined might of the Ottoman forces, their bravery, though beautiful as poetry, proved as fragile as morning mist before the sun. The battle lasted only 2 hours, unfolding like a tragic opera, where the outcome is known from the opening notes, but the beauty lies in the manner of its telling. When the last echoes of combat faded into the afternoon air, King Louis II lay dead beneath his horse in a marsh that had turned from green to red, and the Kingdom of Hungary had effectively ceased to exist as an independent power. The news of Mohacs spread across Europe like ripples from a stone dropped in a still pond, carrying with it a mixture of awe and terror. In Vienna, the Habsburg capital that now stood as the next jewel in Süleyman's path, Emperor Charles V received the reports with the gravity of one who sees destiny approaching like a magnificent but terrible storm. The Ottoman army was no longer a distant threat, but an immediate reality, camping now within striking distance of the heart of Christian Europe. Back in the perfumed chambers of the Topkapi Palace, Hürrem received the news of victory with the quiet joy of one who sees her beloved's dreams taking wing like birds released from golden cages. She had given Süleyman children by now, first Mehmed, then Selim, then Bayezid, and she watched them play in the palace gardens with the knowledge that they were not just her treasures, but the future of an empire that stretched farther than any in history. Their laughter, bright as silver bells, mixed with the sound of fountains and created a music that spoke of a dynasty secure in its power and rich in its promises. As autumn painted the leaves in colors that poets struggled to capture in words, Süleyman made his most audacious decision yet. He would continue northward, beyond the conquered plains of Hungary, beyond the defeated fortresses that now flew Ottoman banners like proud declarations of a new age. His target was Vienna itself, the ancient city that stood like a guardian at the gates of Western Europe, its spires and walls representing everything that had resisted Ottoman expansion for centuries. The siege of Vienna began in late September 1529, as the first cool breaths of autumn whispered through the grape arbors and apple orchards that surrounded the city like a green and golden crown. Süleyman's army, though magnificent as always, had been walking and fighting for months, and they settled around Vienna's walls like tired children, finally reaching the end of a long journey. The city itself, behind its ancient fortifications, prepared for siege like a castle in a fairy tale, its people looking down from tower windows at the Ottoman camps that stretched away toward the horizon like a carpet of stars on earth. For 3 weeks, the siege continued with all the stately drama of a great theatrical performance. The Ottoman cannons, positioned with mathematical precision, thundered against walls that had stood for centuries, each impact sending small earthquakes through the city's foundations. But Vienna, unlike Belgrade or Rhodes, was not alone in its resistance. Relief forces gathered in the distance like storm clouds promising rain, while inside the walls, defenders, led by Count Nicholas von Salm, fought with the desperate beauty of those who know they are holding back the tide of history itself. As October arrived with its cargo of cold rains and early darkness, Süleyman faced a decision that would echo through the halls of history like a melancholy song. Winter was approaching with the inevitability of a tide, and the Ottoman army, magnificent though it was, had not been prepared for a prolonged siege in the gathering cold. Supply lines stretched back across hundreds of miles of territory, thin as spider silk and just as vulnerable to the changing weather. The decision to withdraw came not with fanfare, but with the quiet wisdom of a master strategist who understood that sometimes the greatest victory lies in knowing when to pause rather than when to press forward. Like a chess master who sees 20 moves ahead, Süleyman recognized that Vienna, though tantalizingly close, was not destined to fall this year. The army began its withdrawal as the first snows began to dust the Austrian hills, moving southward like migrating birds following ancient paths home. Yet as the Ottoman forces retreated through the Hungarian plains, now silent under early winter skies, they left behind a Europe forever changed. The siege of Vienna, though unsuccessful, had demonstrated that no Christian stronghold was beyond the reach of Ottoman ambition. The name of Süleyman the Magnificent now carried a weight that made kings wake in the night, and emperors pace their chambers like caged lions, wondering when the Sultan's next campaign would bring his armies back to their gates. In the warm chambers of the Topkapi Palace, where braziers glowed like captured suns and thick carpets muffled every sound to whispers, Hürrem welcomed her Sultan home with embraces that spoke of love deeper than any conquest. She had used the months of his absence not in idle waiting, but in weaving her own web of influence, corresponding with allies and advisors, building networks of loyalty and information that would serve the empire as surely as any army. In her arms, surrounded by the scent of roses and the gentle music of hidden fountains, Süleyman found a peace more precious than any city's surrender. Their children, now growing like flowers in a well-tended garden, gathered around their parents with the natural grace of princes born to rule an empire that spanned continents. Little Prince Mehmed, his father's favorite, showed signs of possessing both Süleyman's strategic mind and Hürrem's quick wit, while his brothers Selim and Bayezid displayed their own unique gifts like jewels, each catching light in their own special way. The palace hummed with the warm contentment of a family secure in its love and confident in its destiny. In the hushed corridors of the Topkapi Palace, where marble floors reflected the dancing flames of oil lamps like pools of liquid starlight, a different kind of campaign was being waged with weapons more subtle than any sword. Politics in the Ottoman court moved like an intricate dance, each step calculated, each gesture carrying meanings that could shift the fate of empires as surely as any battle fought on distant plains. And at the center of this delicate choreography, Hürrem Sultan moved with the grace of a master artist painting with invisible brushes on a canvas made of whispers and dreams. The traditional order of the Ottoman palace had been like a garden, carefully tended for centuries, each plant growing in its designated place, each flower blooming according to ancient patterns. The Sultan's mother, the Valide Sultan, had always held the highest position among the palace women, ruling over the harem with authority as absolute as her son's power over the empire. Concubines came and went like seasons, each bearing children who might one day compete for the throne, but none were expected to capture the Sultan's heart so completely that the very foundations of tradition would tremble. But Hürrem was unlike any woman who had ever walked those perfumed halls. She possessed not just beauty that made poets struggle for adequate words, but intelligence that sparkled like faceted gems and ambition that burned steady as a lighthouse beacon. When she gave birth to Prince Mehmed, the first son among her children, she did not retreat into the quiet satisfaction of maternal accomplishment, but instead began to weave networks of alliance and influence that would have impressed the most seasoned diplomats. The old guard of the palace, those who had served Süleyman's father and grandfather like ancient trees deep-rooted in imperial soil, watched Hürrem's rise with the unease of sailors seeing storm clouds gathering on previously clear horizons. Chief among these was Ibrahim Pasha, Süleyman's childhood friend and Grand Vizier, whose bond with the Sultan had seemed as unbreakable as the stones of the palace walls. Ibrahim had grown up with Süleyman, shared his dreams and ambitions, stood beside him through his first campaigns like a brother in all but blood. Yet as Hürrem's influence blossomed like roses in a favored garden, Ibrahim began to feel the subtle shift in palace dynamics like a sailor, sensing changes in the wind before the storm appears. The Sultan, who had once discussed every decision with his Grand Vizier in chambers where they sat like equals sharing cups of sweet tea and plates of honeyed delicacies, now increasingly sought the counsel of his beloved in private gardens, where only the nightingales could overhear their whispered consultations. The tension between these two powerful figures, one representing the traditional bonds of male friendship and political alliance, the other embodying the transformative power of love and feminine intelligence, created ripples throughout the palace like stones dropped in still water. Courtiers learned to read these subtle currents like experienced navigators studying star charts, knowing that their own fortunes might rise or fall depending on which way the imperial favor finally flowed. Hürrem's greatest innovation was perhaps her understanding that power in the Ottoman court was not simply a matter of military might or traditional authority, but something that could be cultivated through careful attention to human relationships and emotional connections. She befriended the wives and daughters of important officials, exchanging gifts that carried messages of alliance and mutual support. Her letters, written in elegant script on paper perfumed with rosewater, traveled throughout the empire, carrying her influence to distant provinces like seeds scattered by favorable winds. When young Prince Mustafa, Süleyman's eldest son by another concubine, began to show promise as a military commander, Hürrem watched his rise with the careful attention of a gardener, noting which plants grow fastest and strongest. Mustafa was everything an Ottoman prince should be: brave in battle, skilled in strategy, beloved by the Janissaries who saw in him the promise of future greatness. But he was also a potential threat to the future of Hürrem's own children, a reality that she contemplated during long evenings in her chambers like a chess master studying a particularly complex game. Meanwhile, Süleyman's attention had turned eastward toward the ancient lands of Persia, where the Safavid Empire challenged Ottoman authority with the fervor of religious rivalry. The Safavids followed the Shia branch of Islam, while the Ottomans were Sunni, a difference that might seem subtle to outsiders, but burned with the intensity of family feuds that have smoldered for generations. Shah Tahmasp ruled from his capital of Tabriz like a figure from Persian poetry, his court a rival center of artistic and cultural achievement that some claimed surpassed even the glories of Istanbul. The campaign against Persia, which began in 1534, was unlike the European adventures that had brought Süleyman such spectacular success. Instead of ancient fortresses standing firm against siege, the Ottomans faced an enemy that flowed like water, appearing and disappearing across landscapes that seemed to shimmer with heat and uncertainty. The Persian army, rather than meeting the Ottomans in pitched battle, employed tactics as elusive as desert mirages, striking quickly and then melting away into territories they knew better than any foreign invader could ever hope to master. Yet Süleyman's advance into Persia was not without its spectacular moments. When his armies entered Tabriz, the Persian capital opened before them like a flower revealing its heart, its gardens and palaces demonstrating a refinement of taste that even the sophisticated Ottomans found impressive. The conquest of Baghdad, that storied city beside the Tigris River, where the tales of 1001 Nights had first been whispered, brought the Ottomans control of one of Islam's most revered urban centers. Back in Istanbul, Hürrem received news of these eastern victories, with the quiet satisfaction of one who sees her beloved's reputation growing like a garden tended by skilled hands. But she also used Süleyman's absence to consolidate her own position within the palace hierarchy, moving through the corridors of power with steps as measured and purposeful as a master calligrapher forming perfect letters. She established her own household, complete with trusted servants and advisors, who formed a network of loyalty that extended throughout the imperial administration like roots of an ancient tree. The most delicate aspect of Hürrem's rise involved her relationship with the existing power structures of the palace, particularly with Ibrahim Pasha, whose influence had grown so great that ambassadors from foreign courts sometimes wondered whether the Ottoman Empire truly had one ruler or two. Ibrahim's palace, a marvel of architecture that rivaled the Topkapi itself, stood as a monument to the Grand Vizier's wealth and influence. Its gardens perfumed with rare flowers imported from distant lands at enormous expense, its libraries filled with books that glowed like captured sunlight under reading lamps crafted by the finest artisans of Venice and Damascus. The building's facade, decorated with intricate stonework that told stories of conquest and wisdom in visual language that required no words, had become a landmark that foreign visitors described in letters home as evidence of the Ottoman Empire's unprecedented prosperity and sophistication. Yet, this very magnificence, which should have been a source of pride and security, gradually became a source of whispered concern among those who understood the delicate balance of Ottoman court politics. The Grand Vizier's lifestyle had grown so elaborate that it sometimes seemed to rival the Sultan's own, a dangerous development in a system where the slightest appearance of competition with imperial authority could be interpreted as treason. When Ibrahim held receptions in his palace, the guest lists read like a directory of the empire's most powerful figures, while the entertainment provided musicians from Andalusia, dancers from Persia, poets from the greatest academies of the Islamic world, created spectacles that rivaled anything offered in the Sultan's own chambers. Hürrem, with her woman's intuition and careful study of human nature, developed through years of navigating the complex social dynamics of harem life, understood that Ibrahim's greatest weakness lay not in any failing of loyalty or competence, but in his very success, which had made him perhaps too comfortable, too confident, too visible in his exercise of power. She observed the Grand Vizier's interactions with the Sultan with the attention of a master chess player, studying an opponent's moves, noting subtle changes in tone and gesture that revealed the gradual shift from the easy familiarity of childhood friendship to something more complex and potentially problematic. The boy who had played with Prince Süleyman in the palace gardens had grown into a man whose authority was absolute in everything except name, and Hürrem understood intuitively that such arrangements, however practical they might appear, contained within themselves the seeds of inevitable conflict. She began to plant seeds of doubt like a gardener working in moonlight, never directly criticizing the Grand Vizier, but simply raising questions, sharing observations, allowing Süleyman to draw his own conclusions about the wisdom of any single advisor holding so much authority. Her methods were as subtle as morning mist, as gentle as flower petals scattered by evening breezes, yet as persistent as water wearing away the hardest stone through patient repetition over time. During their private conversations in chambers where the only witnesses were silk tapestries depicting scenes from Persian poetry and cats sleeping curled on cushions embroidered with golden threads, she would mention small incidents that individually seemed insignificant, but together painted a picture of a man who had perhaps forgotten the appropriate boundaries between a servant's authority and a master's prerogatives. When Süleyman returned from his Persian campaign in 1536, he found a palace subtly transformed, like a room where furniture has been rearranged while the owner was away, creating new patterns of light and shadow that changed the entire atmosphere without altering any of the fundamental elements. Hürrem greeted him with embraces that spoke of love undimmed by distance and time, but also with reports and observations that demonstrated how completely she had used his absence to master the intricate politics of imperial governance, building networks of alliance and information that extended throughout the palace hierarchy like roots of an ancient tree. Their private conversations, conducted in chambers where oil lamps cast dancing shadows on walls decorated with tiles that captured the colors of sunset and dawn, gradually revealed to the Sultan a new perspective on the delicate balance of power within his own administration. The gradual realization that his oldest friend had perhaps grown too powerful for the good of the empire came to Süleyman not as a sudden revelation but as a slow dawn, each conversation with Hürrem adding another ray of light to a picture that had been forming in shadows for years. He began to notice things he had previously overlooked, the way other officials deferred not just to Ibrahim's position but to his person, the manner in which foreign ambassadors sometimes seemed more interested in gaining the Grand Vizier's approval than the Sultan's, the subtle but unmistakable signs that power within the empire had begun to flow through channels that bypassed the throne itself. These observations accumulated like snowflakes during a winter storm, each one light and seemingly insignificant, but together creating a weight that could no longer be ignored. The fall of Ibrahim Pasha, when it came in 1536, was swift as a falcon's dive and final as winter's first frost settling over a garden that had bloomed too boldly and too long. One evening, the Grand Vizier dined with his Sultan as they had done countless times before, sharing memories of their childhood adventures and discussing plans for the empire's future with the easy familiarity of old friends who had weathered decades of shared triumph and challenge. The meal was served on plates of Chinese porcelain that reflected the candlelight like captured moonbeams, while musicians played melodies soft enough to accompany conversation without overwhelming the subtle flavors of dishes prepared by cooks whose recipes had been perfected through generations of service to imperial tastes. By morning, Ibrahim was dead, executed on Süleyman's orders with the terrible efficiency that characterized all Ottoman administrative decisions. His body removed so quickly that by the time the palace awakened to its daily routines, it was as if the Grand Vizier had simply vanished like a dream upon waking. The palace absorbed this shocking news like sand absorbing water, completely, quietly, with barely a ripple to mark where such a powerful figure had once stood, demonstrating the ultimate supremacy of imperial will over all other considerations, regardless of personal affection or historical service. Servants who had served Ibrahim for years simply transferred their loyalty to new masters, while officials who had reported to him adjusted to new chains of command with the flexibility that characterized successful survival in the complex ecosystem of Ottoman court life. Some historians would later wonder whether Hürrem had orchestrated Ibrahim's downfall like a master puppeteer, manipulating invisible strings, while others argued that Süleyman's decision arose from his own growing unease with his friend's accumulation of power. The truth, like most truths involving the human heart, was probably more complex than either simple explanation could contain, woven from threads of jealousy, political necessity, genuine concern for imperial stability, and the inevitable tension that arises when old friendships encounter new loves. With Ibrahim's removal, Hürrem's position as the Sultan's principal advisor became as unassailable as a mountain peak wreathed in clouds. She moved through the palace corridors with new confidence, her silk robes rustling like whispered prayers, her presence bringing both comfort to allies and unease to potential rivals. The other women of the harem, who had initially viewed her rise with the skeptical amusement reserved for temporary favorites, now understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented in Ottoman history, the emergence of a woman who wielded power not just through beauty and charm, but through intelligence, determination, and an understanding of statecraft that would have impressed professional diplomats. As the 1530s drew to a close, like the final notes of a complex symphony, Süleyman found himself ruling an empire that had expanded to dimensions that would have seemed impossible to his predecessors. From the gates of Vienna in the west to the shores of the Persian Gulf in the east, from the steppes of southern Russia to the deserts of Yemen, the Ottoman realm encompassed territories where dozens of languages were spoken, where countless traditions flourished under the protection of Ottoman tolerance, where merchants traveled routes that connected Europe, Asia, and Africa like golden threads in a vast tapestry. Yet the greatest challenges still lay ahead, like distant storms gathering beyond the horizon. The Mediterranean, that ancient sea which had been called Roman Lake by classical writers, was now becoming an Ottoman Sea, its waters increasingly dominated by fleets flying the crescent banner. But this expansion brought the Ottomans into direct conflict with other maritime powers, particularly the Spanish Empire and its Habsburg allies, setting the stage for confrontations that would echo across the waters like thunder rolling from one shore to another. In the privacy of their chambers, where moonlight filtered through latticed windows to create patterns on floors covered with carpets that told stories in their woven designs, Süleyman and Hürrem would discuss these growing challenges with the intimacy of partners who had learned to share not just love, but the burdens of ruling a world empire. Their children, now ranging from teenagers to young adults, represented the future of the dynasty they had created together, each one a unique combination of their parents' gifts and the vast possibilities that lay before an empire at the height of its power. Prince Mehmed, still Süleyman's favorite, despite the birth of other sons, showed signs of inheriting his father's strategic brilliance and his mother's diplomatic acumen. When he rode through Istanbul's streets, the people would gather to catch glimpses of the young prince, whose destiny seemed written in golden letters across the sky itself. Yet even in these moments of supreme confidence and apparent security, the shadows of future tragedy were already gathering like clouds on a distant horizon, invisible to those living in the bright noon of imperial success, but destined to bring storms that would test the strength of every bond, the wisdom of every decision, the depth of every love. As the golden years of the 1540s melted into the 1550s like honey flowing from a warm spoon, Süleyman's empire had reached a magnificence that poets struggled to capture in verses and artists despaired of rendering in paint. The Sultan himself, now in his 60s, moved through his palace with the stately grace of one who had seen dreams become reality and ambitions transform into lasting monuments. His hair, once dark as a moonless night, now showed silver threads that caught the light like scattered stars, while his eyes held the deep wisdom that comes only to those who have ruled justly and loved completely. Hürrem, his beloved companion through decades of triumph and challenge, had become more than just the Sultan's consort. She had evolved into his partner in the truest sense, her intelligence and political insight as valuable to the empire as any army or treasury. When foreign ambassadors came to the Ottoman court, they would often find themselves dealing not just with the Sultan's official ministers, but with recommendations and perspectives that clearly originated from the woman who had captured and kept the heart of the most powerful ruler in the world. Her correspondence with European queens and noble ladies created diplomatic channels that complemented and sometimes surpassed the official negotiations conducted by viziers and pashas. But even in this golden twilight of their reign, new challenges emerged like distant storm clouds on previously clear horizons. The Mediterranean, which had become increasingly an Ottoman lake, still harbored islands of resistance where Christian forces maintained strongholds that served as both military bases and symbols of defiance. Chief among these was Malta, a small island that sat in the central Mediterranean like a stone fortress rising from waters that reflected the endless dance of sunlight and shadow. The Knights of St. John, those same warrior monks who had been expelled from Rhodes with such honor decades earlier, had made Malta their new home. Under the leadership of Grand Master Jean Parisot de Valette, they had transformed the island into a fortress that combined medieval fortifications with the latest innovations in military engineering. From Malta's harbors, Christian galleys sailed forth to disrupt Ottoman shipping routes like wolves, emerging from a mountain lair to hunt in valleys below. Their success measured not just in captured vessels, but in the psychological impact of proving that Ottoman naval power was not absolute. The decision to conquer Malta came to Süleyman during one of those quiet evening conversations with Hürrem, as they sat in their private garden where fountains sang gentle lullabies and rose petals scattered across paths like fallen stars. The island's strategic importance was undeniable. Whoever controlled Malta could command the sea routes between Constantinople and the Ottoman territories in North Africa, like a key that could lock or unlock the very heart of Mediterranean commerce. But beyond mere strategy lay a matter of honor and reputation, for as long as the knights continued their raids from their island fortress, they served as a reminder that Ottoman power, magnificent though it was, remained incomplete. The Great Siege of Malta began in May 1565, as spring flowers bloomed across the island's rocky landscape, and fishing boats returned to harbors that would soon echo with the thunder of artillery. The Ottoman fleet that appeared on the horizon was magnificent beyond description. Nearly 200 vessels carrying 40,000 men, their sails billowing like clouds that had descended to dance upon the waves. At their head sailed Piali Pasha and Mustafa Pasha, two of Süleyman's most trusted commanders, their experience gained through decades of successful campaigns from Vienna to Baghdad. Yet Malta proved to be, unlike any previous Ottoman conquest, a puzzle that refused to yield to traditional solutions. The island's fortifications, designed by the finest military engineers of the age, incorporated lessons learned from every siege of the previous century. The knights, though numbering fewer than 1,000, fought with the desperate brilliance of men who understood that retreat was impossible, and defeat meant not just death, but the extinction of their order's centuries-old mission. For 4 months, the siege continued like a slow dance between irresistible force and immovable object. Each day brought new assaults that crashed against the island's defenses, like waves against cliffs. Each night brought desperate repairs and preparations for the trials that dawn would bring. The Ottoman forces, despite their overwhelming numbers and superior equipment, found themselves grinding slowly forward through a landscape that seemed to resist every advance, where every stone had been positioned to extract the maximum cost from any attacker. In Constantinople, Süleyman received reports of the siege's progress with growing unease, like a chess master watching a game where his most elegant strategies repeatedly encounter unexpected defenses. Hürrem, reading the carefully neutral language of official dispatches with the eye of one long practiced in decoding diplomatic correspondence, understood that Malta was becoming something more than a military objective. It was becoming a test of Ottoman invincibility itself. As autumn arrived with its cargo of shorter days and cooler nights, bringing relief supplies to the besieged knights, the Ottoman commanders faced the reality that winter storms would soon make continued operations impossible. The decision to withdraw came not with the dramatic finality of a crushing defeat, but with the quiet acknowledgement that sometimes even the mightiest empires must recognize the limits of their reach. The Ottoman fleet departed Malta's waters as the first winter storms gathered on the horizon, carrying with them the knowledge that they had encountered something new in their experience, an enemy that could not be overcome through strength alone. The failure at Malta sent ripples throughout Europe, like stones dropped in still water, each circle carrying news that the Ottoman Empire, for the first time in living memory, had been forced to abandon a major siege. In the courts of Vienna and Madrid, Paris and Rome, the impossible had become reality. Süleyman the Magnificent had finally encountered a fortress he could not conquer, a puzzle he could not solve. But for Süleyman himself, approaching his 70th year with the measured pace of one who had spent decades learning wisdom's hardest lessons, the setback at Malta was less a catastrophe than a reminder that even the grandest dreams must acknowledge the constraints of reality. In the perfumed chambers of the Topkapi Palace, where he and Hürrem had shared so many conversations about the future they were building together, he began to speak more often of legacy than of conquest, more of preservation than of expansion. Tragedy struck their personal world in 1558, when Prince Mehmed, their beloved eldest son and heir apparent, died suddenly at the age of 21. The loss hit both parents like an earthquake that shook the very foundations of their world, transforming their private apartments into chambers of mourning, where even the fountains seemed to weep and the gardens appeared to wilt in sympathy. Hürrem, who had invested so much of her political energy in securing Mehmed's succession, found herself devastated, not just as a mother, but as an architect of dynastic continuity whose carefully laid plans had crumbled like sand castles touched by an unexpected tide. The years that followed Mehmed's death were marked by a subtle but profound shift in the palace dynamics, like a great clock whose mainspring has been damaged and now keeps time differently. Süleyman, though still the supreme ruler of his vast empire, began to delegate more authority to his remaining viziers while spending longer hours in private contemplation. Hürrem, her own health beginning to show signs of the strain that comes from decades of navigating court intrigue, focused her remaining energy on securing the future of her surviving sons, Selim and Bayezid. When Hürrem herself died in 1558, just months after their beloved Mehmed, Süleyman found himself alone in a way he had not experienced since his youth. The woman who had been his partner in love and statecraft, his advisor and confidant, his connection to the world of intimate human emotion that balanced the grand impersonality of imperial rule, was gone like a candle flame extinguished by an evening breeze. The palace, though still filled with thousands of servants and officials, courtiers and concubines, seemed to echo with emptiness that no amount of ceremonial splendor could disguise. Yet even in grief, Süleyman remained the Sultan, and the empire continued to require his attention like a vast garden that needed constant tending. The final chapter of his reign would be written not in the familiar theaters of Vienna or Rhodes, but in the distant Hungarian fortress of Sigetvar, where a Croatian nobleman named Nikola Shubich Zrinski had gathered a small force of defenders who seemed determined to write their names in history through acts of impossible heroism. The siege of Sigetvar began in August 1566, as late summer heat shimmered over the Hungarian plains and the Ottoman army, vast as always, but led now by an aging sultan who rode in a covered litter rather than on horseback, invested the small fortress with methodical precision. Zrinski, the Croatian commander, had no hope of relief and no possibility of escape, yet he chose to resist with the magnificent futility of one who understands that some gestures transcend practical considerations and enter the realm of legend. For Süleyman, now 72 years old, and visibly weakened by decades of campaigning, the siege represented something more than just another military objective. Perhaps he saw in Zrinski's defiance an echo of his own younger self, when he had stood before the walls of Belgrade and Vienna with dreams of unlimited conquest burning in his heart. Or perhaps he simply understood that Sigetvar would be his final campaign, the last chapter in a military career that had reshaped the map of Europe and Asia. On September 6, 1566, as the first autumn mists began to gather over the Hungarian countryside and the siege entered its final phase, Süleyman the Magnificent died quietly in his tent, surrounded by the familiar sounds of an army camp settling into evening routine. His death was kept secret for several days while his commanders completed the conquest of Sigetvar, which finally fell when Zrinski led his remaining men in a final, futile charge that ended with the defenders dead but undefeated in spirit. Thus ended the earthly story of Süleyman the Magnificent, the Sultan who had expanded his empire from the Danube to the Euphrates, from the Black Sea to the shores of Yemen. But his true monument was not the territories he had conquered or the palaces he had built, magnificent though these were. His lasting legacy lived in the legal codes that brought justice to millions, the architectural marvels that transformed skylines from Istanbul to Damascus, the tradition of religious tolerance that allowed diverse peoples to flourish under Ottoman protection, and most of all, in the story of love between a sultan and a woman from distant Ruthenia, whose intelligence and devotion had helped guide an empire through its golden age. In the gardens of the Topkapi Palace, where Süleyman and Hürrem had walked together through so many seasons of triumph and sorrow, the fountains continue to sing their gentle songs, and the roses bloom each spring with the same beauty that once brought joy to imperial hearts. Their children's children would rule the Ottoman Empire for centuries more, carrying forward the dynasty they had established together, while poets and storytellers would weave their tale into epics that would be whispered in palace chambers and sung in distant villages long after the last Ottoman Sultan had passed into history. And in the end, as all great stories must, this one dissolves into the golden mist of legend, where love and ambition, conquest and devotion, triumph and tragedy become part of the eternal dance that connects all human hearts across the centuries. For those who would sleep and dream, the tale of Süleyman and Hürrem remains as a gentle reminder that even in the grand theatre of empire and politics, it is love that writes the most enduring verses, and tenderness that builds the monuments that time cannot erode. Let these stories carry you now into peaceful sleep, where dreams of distant palaces and gentle voices, singing lullabies in languages both foreign and familiar, can transport you to that timeless realm where all tales of love and greatness find their perfect eternal rest. In the name of love that transcends empires, of dreams that outlast kingdoms, and of stories that carry us gently into the peaceful harbor of sleep, this tale of Süleyman the Magnificent finds its ending, not in death, but in the promise that great loves and noble dreams live forever in the hearts that remember them.